June 15, 1943, Solomon Sea, Southwest Pacific. The night was heavy with salt and silence. Deep beneath the black water, the Japanese submarine I-24 crept north at 5 knots. Its diesel engines long shut down, its crew whispering in the stale air. Commander Kojima leaned over the hydrophone operator, listening to the faint thrum of propellers somewhere far above. Then cutting through the ocean's murmur came a sound no one aboard had ever heard before. It was sharp, metallic, and alive, as if the sea itself had turned against them. The pulse rolled through the steel hull, echoing in the men's bones. Seconds later it came again, another ping, then another, closer each time. Panic flickered in the narrow eyes of the crew. Miles away, aboard the destroyer escort USS Nicholas, an American sonar operator pressed a headphone to his ear, watching a green blip shimmer across his screen. The return was clear, 4,300 yards bearing steady. "Contact confirmed," he whispered. Above him, the captain smiled faintly. In that instant, the silent ocean was no longer safe. The Americans had learned to see with sound, and the hunters of the deep had become the hunted. When 1943 opened, the Pacific War had shifted beneath the waves. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once dominant on the surface, had turned to its undersea fleet to disrupt American supply convoys pushing west from New Guinea toward the Solomons. Their long-range I-class submarines, fast, deep-diving, armed with the Type 95 oxygen torpedo, had already sunk scores of Allied ships in the early months of the war. To Japanese commanders, the ocean seemed an infinite refuge. Their doctrine prized stealth and patience, silent running, periscope discipline, a belief that distance and darkness guaranteed survival. But in laboratories half a world away, U.S. scientists were changing the rules of concealment. At Harvard, Columbia, and the newly created Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, a generation of physicists and engineers, men who had once built radios and vacuum tubes, were now studying how sound traveled through seawater. They called their new device Sonar, short for sound navigation and ranging. The principle was simple: send a pulse of sound, measure the echo, and calculate distance by timing its return. In practice, it demanded miracles of precision: oscillators that could endure pressure, microphones that could detect whispers across miles of turbulent water, and computers made of dials and slide rules. By mid-1942, American destroyers and smaller destroyer escorts were being fitted with the QC and QHB sonar sets, compact domes mounted beneath the bow that could sweep in arcs and track contacts through pitch and roll. The operator's world was a dim green screen and a set of headphones. Each ping was both a question and an answer. If the echo grew sharper, the target was closing. If it blurred or vanished, the prey had turned or dived. Training schools sprang up along the East Coast where young sailors learned to see with their ears. They practiced until they could identify a submarine's movement by the tone of the return alone. For the Japanese, this invisible weapon arrived as a rumor. Survivors of early encounters told of strange mechanical birds in the air, water, ships that could find them without sight. The Imperial Navy possessed its own hydrophones, but relied almost entirely on passive detection, listening, not probing. They feared that any active system would reveal their own position. Thus, when the first sharp pings rolled down into the depths near the Solomon Sea, the shock was cultural as well as tactical. To them, the Americans had committed an unthinkable act. They had shouted into the sea, and the sea had answered. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King's anti-submarine board grasped the strategic implications. Every Liberty ship, every fuel tanker steaming toward Australia was a lifeline. Each convoy needed guardians who could strike the unseen. Out of that urgency came new ships built purely around sonar and depth charges, the destroyer escort. Cheap, fast, and bristling with detection gear, these tin cans would become the workhorses of the undersea war. By the summer of 1943, task groups of these escorts were sweeping the Solomon approaches. They sailed in hunting lines, each ship 10 miles apart, their sonars overlapping like the beams of a vast invisible radar. The technique was mathematical, almost industrial, proof that America's strength was as much in calculation as in courage. When one ship made contact, others converged, triangulating by sound until depth charges fell in geometric precision. It was here, amid reefs and rain squalls, that the myth of the untouchable Japanese submarine began to dissolve. The Americans had weaponized acoustics. The ocean itself had joined their arsenal. By the time the I-24 crept through these same waters in June 1943, she was not alone in the dark, but surrounded by an unseen network of listening machines ready to announce her presence with a single, merciless ping. The ping that echoed through the Pacific in 1943 had a pedigree stretching back 2 decades. During the 1920s, Allied scientists who had first experimented with echo ranging to find icebergs after the Titanic disaster quietly refined their devices in naval labs. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, America already possessed prototype sonar sets capable of detecting a submarine's hull at several thousand yards, but the fleet had not yet learned to fight by sound. The early war years were their laboratory. The transition began in the Atlantic. Convoys bound for Britain faced German U-boats, and American destroyers equipped with British-style ASDIC learned the discipline of underwater pursuit, maintaining a sonar fix through turns, timing depth charge drops by echo range, learning to interpret the Doppler slide that revealed if the target was closing or running. Every lesson crossed the Panama Canal. By 1943, the first Pacific hunter-killer groups were at sea, marrying sonar, radar, and code-breaking intelligence into one chain of detection. When Japanese submarines began stalking the supply lanes to Guadalcanal, they met opponents who could triangulate their position before a periscope ever broke the surface. Technically, the advantage lay in integration. American destroyer escorts carried the QHB sonar, whose narrow beam could scan 180 degrees and track a moving target through violent seas. Below decks, an operator wearing thick rubber headphones listened for the faint change in tone between the outbound ping and the returning echo. A trained ear could distinguish rock from steel, a drifting mine from a submarine hull. The ship's plotting room converted those sounds into geometry, bearing, range, and rate of change until mathematics replaced guesswork. In wartime logbooks, these engagements appear as sterile tables of numbers, but each column of figures represented a hidden duel fought in the dark. Japanese engineers had experimented with passive hydrophones since the 1930s, yet they doubted the practicality of active sonar. Their equipment could detect engines within a mile, but tropical thermoclines, the warm layers that refracted sound, often masked contacts. They compensated with doctrine: submerge by day, surface by night, strike at dusk when escorts turned toward sunset glare. This method had worked against Allied convoys off Australia in 1942. Then the Americans began pinging. The psychological blow was immense. Imperial Navy reports describe crews who surfaced expecting aircraft, unable to believe that a ship's pulse had reached them through miles of water. Officers complained that the ocean now spoke English. On the surface, the U.S. Navy rewrote its tactics to exploit that fear. Convoy protection became a chess game. A sonar contact would be held by one ship, while another executed a wide circling run to box the submarine's escape route. When range closed to under 800 yards, depth charges rolled from rails in calibrated intervals, exploding at preset depths. Even if no direct hit followed, the blasts forced the enemy down where batteries drained faster than oxygen. American analysts calculated that repeated ping pressure alone reduced Japanese endurance by 30%. Captains broke contact sooner, believing detection meant inevitable death. Behind every engagement stood an industrial miracle. The Western Electric Company, General Electric, and Bell Labs turned sonar into mass production. By 1944, the Navy accepted more than 10,000 transducer domes a year, each tested in giant freshwater tanks where engineers measured frequency loss against simulated ocean salinity. This was sound as weaponized engineering. While Japanese factories struggled under bombing and raw material shortages, America's laboratories synchronized design with the assembly line, ensuring that every destroyer sent west carried identical instruments and training manuals. Standardization, mundane but revolutionary, meant that an operator from Boston could step aboard a ship in Noumea and instantly read the same dials. Culturally, sonar transformed sailors into technicians. Recruits fresh from Iowa farms learned to interpret oscilloscopes instead of horizons. They spoke of ping discipline, of keeping the rhythm steady so as not to confuse echoes with harmonics. The sea became a data field rather than a mystery. For an island nation that had once measured power by battleships, the shift to invisible combat was profound. In the space of 2 years, America had converted the Pacific from a domain of ambush to a mapped grid of sound. And by the time Japanese commanders realized this, their once proud submarine force had begun to vanish, hunted by destroyers that no longer needed eyes to see. By the middle of 1943, the United States had turned sonar into an ecosystem rather than a single instrument. Each part of that ecosystem represented a different angle on the same revolution: engineering, tactics, human psychology, and the culture of measurement that defined America's wartime industry. The Japanese captains who heard those first metallic pulses were not merely confronting a new device. They were meeting an entire way of fighting that fused science with seamanship. On a destroyer's lowest deck, where humidity coated every switch, the sonar operator and the chief engineer shared a ritual before every patrol. The engineer calibrated the transducer crystal, a ring of quartz encased in steel oil, to the water's salinity and temperature, adjusting frequency until the background hum matched the chart for that latitude. Every theater demanded a different setting. The tropical Pacific swallowed high frequencies faster than the North Atlantic. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships sent out monthly bulletins recommending optimal kilocycles for each region, transforming the ocean from mystery into map. That quiet discipline of tuning was invisible to the admirals, yet it decided whether a submarine would be found or lost. Once contact was made, mathematics took command. A sonar plotter calculated bearing rate, degrees per minute of echo movement, and compared it to ship speed. If the echo moved twice as fast as the own ship's turn, the submarine was circling. Operators learned to visualize motion in 3 dimensions, predicting where the next ping would land. It was geometry, translated into violence. Destroyer escorts such as USS England and USS Buckley proved that precision could replace luck. England's crew, using only sonar and hedgehog projectors, sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days. Each kill validated the doctrine: consistency beat intuition. By contrast, Japanese commanders still relied on periscope sweeps and gut instinct, a fatal anachronism. Back home, sonar manufacturing mirrored the nation's automotive lines. At Western Electric's Hawthorne Works near Chicago, women in blue overalls soldered copper coils onto transducer mounts under the same lights once used for telephone assembly. Quality inspectors immersed finished domes in tanks of brine and listened for clear tone return. A defective crystal was discarded, not repaired. Volume mattered more than thrift. This philosophy, standardize, simplify, replace, allowed thousands of ships to share interchangeable parts. To Japanese planners, whose sonar components were handmade in small batches, such scale appeared impossible. They underestimated the power of redundancy. When an American unit failed, another identical one waited in a crate. For those hunted, the ping became a sound of dread. Interrogations of captured Japanese submariners later recorded vivid reactions. One petty officer compared it to a hammer knocking inside our skulls. Another said he felt the vibration through his teeth. The metallic pulse carried through steel and bone alike, eroding discipline. Commanders ordered crews to ignore it, to dive deeper, yet the resonance followed them into the dark. Unlike depth charges, which struck suddenly, sonar was a prelude, the audible promise of annihilation. American destroyers sometimes exploited this by varying ping rhythm to suggest proximity, forcing submarines into premature dives where oxygen dwindled. In psychological warfare, sound became a weapon of persuasion. At its core, sonar revealed contrasting philosophies. Japan's naval heritage was rooted in craftsmanship and intuition. A skilled navigator or lookout was honored for personal excellence. America's approach celebrated process, the belief that ordinary people, trained and equipped within a system, could outperform individual genius. The sonar school at Key West embodied that ideal. Recruits with no maritime experience learned to interpret echoes as a language. Their instructors told them, "You are the ship's eyes." It was democratized expertise, mass-produced like the devices they used. To observers abroad, this blending of human and machine seemed impersonal, but it was precisely that impersonality that multiplied effectiveness. Not everyone celebrated the victory of technology. Naval chaplains and veteran skippers sometimes wondered aloud if war fought by instruments would strip courage of meaning. Yet for those on convoy duty, sonar was salvation. Each successful detection meant hundreds of merchant sailors alive to see another dawn. In this tension, between mechanization and morality, the modern era of warfare was born. The sea, once ruled by daring and eyesight, now obeyed equations. By the end of 1943, every major American task group in the Pacific operated with coordinated sonar nets, while Japanese submarines increasingly confined themselves to reconnaissance or one-way supply missions. The difference between an empire rising and one fading could now be measured in milliseconds, the time between ping and echo. What had begun as a simple pulse of sound had evolved into the heartbeat of a new kind of war. By the start of 1944, sonar had become the nervous system of the Allied fleet. Every escort, corvette, and destroyer operated as part of a single auditory organism whose collective hearing reached across hundreds of miles of ocean. What followed were new angles, technical, operational, and cultural, that illustrated how this invisible technology reshaped the very nature of sea warfare. Early sonar sets could only track one target directly ahead, but new dome designs allowed side-scanning sweeps. The dome's rubber-coated quartz crystals could tilt up or down, detecting changes in depth. This meant a submarine could no longer hide beneath a thermal layer or slip below a convoy's path. In the Coral Sea, hunter-killer groups practiced ladder searches. Destroyers sailed in parallel lines while aircraft circled above, relaying bearings by radio. Each ping overlapped another until no silent corridor remained. For Japanese captains accustomed to three-dimensional freedom, the ocean now felt like a cage of sound. The Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, formalized what sailors had learned by instinct. Every engagement was logged, bearing, range, sea state, kill probability, and fed into punch card machines at the Naval Observatory. Analysts plotted thousands of data points to refine depth charge spacing and sonar frequency. Out of those spreadsheets emerged the Hedgehog, a forward-firing mortar that allowed a destroyer to attack without losing sonar contact. Engineers calculated projectile angles so precisely that a single salvo could cover a cone of 200 feet at 250 yards. When one struck, the sonar operator heard silence instead of echo, the unmistakable sign that steel had been torn open below. Sound alone was not enough. It needed vision. Long-range patrol bombers, Catalinas and Liberators, carried magnetic anomaly detectors that sensed a submarine's metal hull. Once aircraft radioed coordinates, destroyers raced in to confirm with sonar. The two technologies created a feedback loop. Radar found a wake, sonar fixed the target, depth charges finished it. In March 1944, this triad sank the Japanese I-174 off New Guinea after a 9-hour pursuit in which sonar contact never wavered. The destroyer captain later wrote, "We fought an unseen opponent in a perfectly visible world of instruments." Operating sonar was not glamorous. The room was dark, the noise constant, and concentration absolute. Operators rotated every 2 hours to avoid ping fatigue, a form of auditory hallucination in which echoes seemed to linger even after contact was lost. The Navy responded by introducing synthetic training simulators, wooden boxes fitted with speakers that played recorded echoes from previous battles. Recruits practiced identifying speed and distance by ear until they could reproduce range within 50 yards. Instructors noted that farmers and musicians excelled. Both had innate rhythm and pitch memory. By 1944, sonar schools graduated thousands every quarter, turning ordinary Americans into technicians of perception. Realizing their vulnerability, Japanese scientists at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal attempted to design counter-sonar coatings made of asphalt and rubber. These anechoic tiles could dampen echoes slightly, but were brittle and peeled under pressure. Crews tried desperate evasive maneuvers, blowing oil, releasing debris, even carrying noise-making decoys. Yet American sonar simply filtered the interference. Operators learned to identify false returns by rhythm. Some submarines reverted to long, silent drifts, hoping to ride ocean currents. The tactic prolonged survival but ended missions. The war of patience replaced the war of offense. Admiral Takagi summarized the crisis in a 1944 memo. "Our ears are blind. Theirs can see. The sonar revolution was inseparable from industrial momentum. Bell Labs, General Electric, and RCA competed to refine transducer design, each improvement shared through the Joint Allied Committee so Britain and America fielded compatible systems. The United States Maritime Commission established mobile calibration barges that visited ports from San Diego to Brisbane, testing every destroyer's frequency response before it sailed. This logistics chain, technicians, replacement parts, standardized manuals, was an empire of maintenance. While Axis industry fractured under bombing, the Allies could repair a damaged dome in hours. It was warfare sustained by organization rather than heroism. For American sailors, the ping became a symbol of control, a heartbeat that proved they were not adrift. In port towns, children imitated it with tin cans, calling it the sound that finds Japs. Newspapers romanticized sonar as a new sense granted by science. The myth carried weight. Morale rose whenever the destroyers returned, claiming another confirmed echo. For the Japanese, the same sound haunted survivors. Diaries recovered from sunken boats described dreams filled with endless ringing, a reminder that the ocean itself had turned informer. By the end of 1944, the sonar grid stretched from Pearl Harbor to Leyte Gulf. Submarine warfare, once the Empire's pride, had been reduced to sporadic ambushes and transport runs. The ocean that had once hidden Japan's hunters now betrayed them at every turn. The next stage of the story would reveal how that betrayal reached its peak, when an entire convoy learned through sound alone that the balance of the Pacific had shifted forever. October 1944, Philippine Sea. The convoy codenamed TA-4 crept westward under a moonless sky. 10 Japanese cargo ships carried reinforcements toward Leyte, guarded by 4 destroyers, an echo of the power that had once ruled the Pacific. Beneath them rolled black water thousands of feet deep, quiet except for the rhythmic churn of propellers. Each commander believed darkness still guaranteed safety. What they did not know was that 30 miles ahead, 2 U.S. destroyer escorts, USS England and USS Raby, were triangulating every sound that touched their hulls. At 0200, England's sonar operator, Seaman First Class Charles Moore, heard it, a faint pulse breaking the steady hum of the ocean floor. He tapped the gain knob, refined the signal, and marked bearing 100.32 digger. Contact, possible sub, range 4,800 yards. The word raced through the ship. General quarters sounded, hatches slammed, engines throttled back to half speed. Above deck, the night seemed endless, but below, the screen flickered with life. A single moving blip that told an entire story of pursuit. The destroyer's captain ordered a ping. The operator switched from passive to active mode. A metallic chirp pulsed into the sea, returned in a fraction of a second, and confirmed the unimaginable. Depth 230 feet, bearing steady. The enemy was not asleep, it was maneuvering. On board the Japanese submarine RO-41, Commander Sugiyama shouted for silent running, cut engines, and ordered the boat down another 50 feet. For 30 seconds there was calm. Then the ping came again, louder, closer. In the control room's red light, crewmen froze. Someone whispered, "It's looking for us." On England, the plotting team drew a red arc on greaseboard. Closing at 12 knots, estimated intercept 4 minutes. The captain's voice was calm. Maintain contact. Prepare hedgehogs. The forward deck crew swung the launchers out, each spigot loaded with a 65-pound explosive charge set to detonate only on impact. This was the innovation that changed the underwater war. No blind guessing, no depth charge curtains. The ship could now attack and still hear its prey. At 0216, Moore called out, "Target dead ahead, steady range 900 yards. The captain gave the word. 16 projectiles arced into the dark sea, entered with brief flashes, and disappeared. Seconds later came a muffled, cascading roar. 1 explosion, then 3 more. The sonar trace vanished. The bridge went silent except for the faint crackle of the intercom. Moore's voice returned, subdued but certain. Contact lost, destroyed. The attack lasted less than 20 minutes, but its implications rippled far beyond one sinking. For the first time, the Japanese Navy understood that the Americans had developed sonar capable of tracking continuously through turns, thermoclines, and evasive dives. There was no longer a safe depth. Sound could bend, chase, and strike with scientific precision. In the words of a surviving engineer later captured at Truk, "After the first ping, we knew the war beneath the sea was over." Across the Pacific that autumn, Similar scenes unfolded night after night. U.S. hunter-killer groups patrolled the approaches to the Philippines, each a miniature orchestra of radar, sonar, and radio intelligence. When a contact appeared, ships coordinated their bearings so that pings overlapped. An acoustic crossfire. The sea, once vast and unknowable, had been mapped into a grid of echoes. For Japanese submarines, movement itself became risk. The statistics told the story. In the final quarter of 1944, American sonar contacts in the Pacific tripled, while confirmed sinkings of Japanese subs reached 35 in 3 months. More devastating than the losses was the psychological contagion. Captains began surfacing prematurely to recharge batteries, terrified of every stray vibration. Crews whispered that the Americans could see in the dark. Even Japanese destroyers lacking equivalent equipment found themselves deaf and blind beside their opponents. Inside U.S. Navy archives, after-action reports from the Leyte campaign read like clinical autopsies. Each entry lists time, bearing, and range, ending with the same phrase: target disappeared, probable destruction. Behind those words were human tremors. The sonar operator's sweat, the helmsman's knuckles white on the wheel, the sudden silence that followed a kill. The clash had shifted from spectacle to science. No flashes, no cries, only numbers and echoes. In Washington, admirals studying those reports realized they were witnessing a historical pivot. Sonar had done to the submarine what radar had done to the bomber. It had erased surprise. Where once war had depended on who could strike unseen, now victory belonged to those who could measure fastest. American destroyers had become laboratories of precision, their crews scientists of detection. The night the RO-41 was destroyed, England's captain logged one final note before dawn. Sea calm, contact terminated. No survivors observed. Sonar efficiency flawless. The phrase captured a paradox, the quiet perfection of mechanized hunting, and the dawning truth that technology, not numbers or courage, would decide the Pacific's fate. From that night forward, every Japanese submarine commander who heard the faint metallic ping knew what it meant. The Americans had found them, and time itself had turned against them. November 1944, East China Sea. The destroyer USS Chatelaine rolled gently on swells under a haze of drizzle. Her sonar room was lit only by the pale glow of dials. Seaman Jack Tate leaned close to his headset, hearing the ocean as music, 1,000 tones of current, shrimp, propeller, and echo. At 03:14, a perfect note cut through it all, a returning pulse from a depth of 260 feet. He raised a hand. Contact. Steady bearing. Above, Captain O'Donnell checked the clock. If the bearing didn't drift in 3 minutes, the target was stationary. A Japanese submarine dead in the water, batteries drained. The bearing held. The Chatelaine turned gently down the line of sound, her propellers slowed to a whisper. In the plotting room, grease pencils marked vectors. One destroyer after another slid into position. Within minutes, an entire hunter-killer group, the Pope, Pillsbury, and Guadalcanal, formed a triangle around a single echo. The Pacific, once limitless, had narrowed to a box 4 miles wide. When the first pattern of depth charges thundered, the sea rose in white plumes. Seconds later, a crewman shouted, "Oil on the surface!" But the sonar still pulsed back a heartbeat. The submarine lived. O'Donnell ordered active sweep, ping, ping, ping. Each return came closer, brighter. The American gunners reloaded the Hedgehogs. Then, for the first time in the war, they tried something untested, continuous tracking while attacking. The operator kept the sonar beam fixed on the target even as explosions rolled through the water. It worked. Every echo sharpened until the scope suddenly went blank. Silence. Moments later, a column of air erupted through the waves, a dying submarine's final breath. What astonished Japanese analysts afterward was not that the boat was found, but that it had been seen by mathematics. American destroyers were no longer guessing where to drop explosives. They were computing where steel would be 3 seconds ahead. Sonar had fused with fire control radar and analog calculators, forming the first integrated combat information system at sea. On land, engineers at the Naval Research Lab read the reports and began drafting a new doctrine, ASDIC to weapon link. It meant one ping could trigger a chain, sound, range, trajectory, fire, in under 10 seconds. That efficiency crushed the last illusion of invisibility. When Tokyo's Naval Staff College ran the numbers, they concluded grimly that a submerged Japanese sub now faced a 78% chance of detection within 10 minutes of contact. Even before a torpedo could be loaded, death was statistically inevitable. For those who survived, defeat felt geological, as if the ocean's laws had changed. Lieutenant Matsuda of I-53 later wrote, "We fought silence and silence betrayed us." Every metallic echo on a bulkhead was a reminder that somewhere above, unseen men listened with machines more patient than any hunter. On the American side, exhilaration mixed with unease. The destroyer crews joked that sonar gave them God's ears, yet every success carried a whisper of dread. The moment an echo vanished, they knew an entire crew had vanished too. O'Donnell's log closed that night with the line, "Sound ceased. Contact destroyed. Ocean calm again." The calm was deceptive. In truth, the Pacific had become an acoustic battlefield, its silence forever altered by the human need to measure. By early 1945, Japan's undersea fleet was no longer a threat, but a statistic. Out of more than 200 operational submarines, fewer than 30 remained. American escorts, coordinated by sonar grids, swept sea lanes from Guam to Okinawa. Each success tightened the loop between laboratory and battlefield, between scientist and sailor. The ping had become not only a signal of detection, but a declaration of industrial supremacy. That November night in the East China Sea marked the moment the balance of the Pacific tipped irreversibly. The empire that once ruled by stealth found itself drowned in its own silence, while across the horizon the steady rhythm of American sonar continued. Calm, mechanical, unstoppable, the heartbeat of a new era beneath the waves. January 1945, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Inside a wooden office overlooking the harbor, Commander Harold Bowen of the Naval Research Laboratory scanned a thick report stamped "Confidential. Anti-Submarine Summary Number 47. The numbers were extraordinary. In the preceding 6 months, Allied destroyers had sunk more than 70 Japanese submarines. Losses among hunter-killer escorts were minimal. For the first time since 1941, shipping lanes to Australia and the Philippines were open and secure. The decisive factor listed on the first page was one word in capital letters: sonar. The transformation had been quiet yet absolute. At the war's start, sonar was a temperamental instrument, fragile, easily fooled by temperature layers, often ignored by captains who preferred instinct. By 1945, it had become the supreme authority of the sea. Every convoy relied on it. Every submarine feared it. Where radar guarded the skies, sonar ruled the depths. Reports from Tokyo painted a mirror image of despair. Japanese naval intelligence noted that the average lifespan of a new submarine had dropped below 2 patrols. Crews sailed knowing that the first ping they heard might also be their last. Factories still built boats, but without hope. Steel coffins launched into an ocean that now listened. Admiral Toyota admitted privately that, "We have lost the invisible war." In the Pacific Fleet's destroyers, the mood was different but equally introspective. Sailors who once fought by sight now trusted a pulse of sound. The ping men became celebrities, their headphones symbols of precision warfare. At Pearl Harbor's sonar school, classrooms overflowed. Instructors used recordings from real battles to teach cadets how to read an enemy's life in echo patterns. Charts of probable kill probabilities lined the walls, each mark a measure of technological evolution. Industry mirrored that discipline. At Bell Labs, engineers refined quartz crystals and transducer domes, while shipyards in San Francisco and Boston standardized mounts so any destroyer could replace a damaged dome in hours. Factories turned research into logistics, another front of war fought with wiring diagrams and shipping manifests. America's strength was not only invention but replication. Every improvement multiplied across oceans until it became an ecosystem of efficiency. For civilians, the consequences were largely invisible yet immense. Merchant crews who once dreaded torpedo wakes now sailed with confidence. Convoys carried food, medicine, and reinforcements through routes that had been death traps only a year earlier. The flow of supplies shortened campaigns, saving thousands of lives ashore. War correspondents called sonar the weapon that feeds armies. Among Japanese survivors, the psychological aftermath lingered longest. Captured officers described the ping as a kind of ghost, something that haunted them even in sleep. One engineer interrogated at Guam confessed, "When we heard it, we felt naked in the sea." Their empire had entered the conflict, believing that discipline could defeat machines. They ended it realizing that machines had learned discipline. Even after victory, American officers remained cautious. Reports warned that complacency could dull the Navy's ears. Research continued into new frequencies, automatic range plotting, and countermeasures. The lesson was clear. Dominance existed only as long as innovation did. By the spring of 1945, the once silent ocean had become an instrument tuned to human ambition. Each ping that rang through its depths carried not just the location of an enemy, but the echo of an era ending. The moment when science, for the first time in naval history, rendered stealth obsolete. The next and final section will draw that conclusion fully, reflecting on how sound itself became a symbol of the modern world's victory over darkness. August 1945, Pacific Ocean. The war was ending, but the sea still echoed. From Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, U.S. ships continued their steady patrols, their sonar pings rolling outward like the heartbeats of a new empire. Below, wrecked submarines rested on the seabed, silent, corroding reminders of a vanished confidence. For Japan's surviving naval officers, defeat had not come through battle alone, but through acoustics, through the hum of machinery that had turned the ocean itself into an American ally. In post-war debriefings, Japanese engineers admitted they had underestimated not the weapon, but the method. The Americans had fused science and production into rhythm, research flowing to factory to fleet. Every ping heard in 1945 carried behind it the effort of thousands. Lab technicians calibrating quartz, welders sealing domes, and young sailors interpreting echoes at midnight. Victory had become measurable, predictable, repeatable. At sea, many American crews who had hunted submarines now felt uneasy in peace. They remembered the stillness after a kill, the quiet ocean swallowing what was left. Some spoke of sonar as if it had gained consciousness, a mechanical sense that never slept. It wasn't magic, one operator later said, just math. But it sounded like judgment. By September, U.S. Navy scientists were already drafting the next generation of acoustic technology. Sonar would evolve into undersea mapping, civilian research, even early oceanography. The same pulse that once found enemies would now find continents beneath the waves. What began as war became understanding. For the men who had listened in those dark rooms, the sound of a ping would never again mean safety. It meant power, knowledge, inevitability. In the last official Navy report of 1945, one line summarized the revolution. "The ocean is no longer silent. It speaks and we have learned to listen." That sentence closed the chapter on submarine warfare and opened one on the modern world, an age where discovery and destruction were divided only by intent. The Japanese captains had been right about one thing: sound travels forever. And across the quiet Pacific, even years later, veterans swore they could still hear it, the faint metallic heartbeat of the machine that changed the sea.